They say civilization began in Sumer, but what if it didn't? What if the temples of Uruk were not the starting point, but merely echoes of something far older? Something now buried, not only beneath layers of earth, but beneath layers of silence. A silence so deliberate, so pervasive, it feels almost sacred, like a memory the world was never meant to recall. Why do the first myths speak not of beginnings, but of survivors? Why do so many ancient texts whisper of a time before time, a world lost, not in forgetfulness, but in erasure? Tonight, we follow those faint traces, through broken tablets, forbidden symbols, and gaps in the record no one dares to explain. We trace the outline of a story long denied. Welcome to Deformed History, a space where the past doesn't sleep. It waits. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Right now, I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. They wrote that history begins in Sumer, that the wheel turned first on Mesopotamian soil. That writing bloomed with cuneiform, and kingship descended from the heavens onto the land between two rivers. But why does it feel like we arrived in the middle of a story already half told? In the silence before Sumer, there are no loud voices, only murmurs, scraps of bones too old to fit the textbook narrative, maps once thought to be forgeries, now quietly admitted to be authentic. There are ruins where there should be none, like the megalithic platforms of Baalbek, whose stones defy not only engineering, but chronology. Or the underwater complex off the coast of Yonaguni, shaped too precisely, aligned too purposefully, to be the work of coincidence or nature. We are told these are outliers, aberrations. But how many aberrations must accumulate before they cease to be exceptions? Why does Göbekli Tepe, a site dated to 9600 BCE, possess carvings of such symbolic complexity, astronomical precision, and ritual intentionality when humans were supposed to still be roaming in nomadic bands? Why was it buried, not by time, but deliberately, as though someone wanted to hide it from posterity? Who were those that built it, and what did they fear? When Klaus Schmidt uncovered those stones in Turkey, he said it rewrote everything. But the ink has never dried. Institutions trembled, not from awe, but from the discomfort of a paradigm threatened. As if knowing too much might fracture the story too neatly told. There's a curious silence in the textbooks about these anomalies, a deliberate choosing of blindness. The Sumerians are allowed to be first, because they left behind tablets, bureaucracy, and gods with human failings. They are comprehensible. But what of those who came before and left no name, only stone and shadow? There is a fracture here, a missing prelude. We measure the age of civilization by the presence of writing, yet ignore that language itself may have roots far older than ink or chisel. Linguist Vyacheslav Ivanov once proposed a proto-world language, a mother tongue whispered before the Tower of Babel. Could echoes of that language still survive, not in scripts, but in symbols, in mandalas, spirals, and serpents that repeat across cultures separated by oceans and millennia? Why do the myths of disparate peoples speak the same metaphors? A golden age lost, a flood, a descent of knowledge from stars or gods or watchers? Perhaps the story we know is only the last chapter, and even that redacted. The farther back we look, the more we find evidence not of progress, but of decline from an older sophistication, not in gadgets or glass, but in a way of being, a harmonization with cosmos, number, and form. What if the first humans weren't climbing upward, but reaching back to reclaim what had been lost? This is not a call to believe, only to wonder. Because before the cities, before the kings, before the clay and the stylus, there may have been something else. Something older, something deliberately forgotten. And the question hangs, unanswered. If Sumer was not the first, then what came before? The sands of time are known to bury much. But what if they didn't simply conceal? What if they protected? There are places where history goes quiet, not from absence, but from intervention. One such place lies in the highlands of Bolivia, the plateau of Altiplano, where the ruins of Tiwanaku and its enigmatic neighbor Puma Punku defy time itself. The stones scattered there are not eroded whispers of a civilization in decline. They are precise, machine-cut geometries, as if someone once carved them with instruments no Bronze Age artisan should possess. Interlocking blocks with microscopic symmetry, cut so smooth they seem etched by lasers. These aren't myths. They are real. They stand. And no one can explain them. Archaeologists place Tiwanaku at around 1,500 years old. But the orientation of its temples, aligned not to our current poles, but to an older axial tilt, suggests something more. Charles Hapgood's crust displacement theory, once ridiculed, proposes that Earth's crust may have shifted rapidly in the distant past, altering the geographic and magnetic coordinates of our planet. If true, it would mean that Puma Punku could predate the Ice Age. But such a date would disrupt everything. It would imply not only advanced stonework before the dawn of known civilization, but a people who understood geodesy, magnetism, and celestial mechanics long before the Greeks ever drew circles in the sand. Still, the mainstream shrugs. Because what else can it do? No texts were left behind, no scrolls, no kings' names etched into obelisks, just the stones. And stones, they say, cannot speak. But what if they do? What if form itself is a language? A frequency encoded not in vowels, but in vibration, in geometry, resonance, proportion? Across the world, ancient structures hum with curious similarities. The same ratios appear again and again. The golden ratio, pi, the square root of 2. Even the Fibonacci sequence, which governs everything from sunflower seeds to spiral galaxies, finds its way into the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. This is not coincidence. But if it is not coincidence, then how? Was it shared memory? Was there a common ancestor culture? Not an empire of conquest, but of knowledge? A civilization that seeded others not through war, but through wisdom. Graham Hancock once called them a species with amnesia, not forgotten by others, but having forgotten themselves. In the myths of the Dogon people in Mali, there is the tale of Nomo, an amphibious being who descended from the stars, bringing knowledge, language, order. The Dogon knew of Sirius B, the invisible companion star to Sirius, long before modern telescopes confirmed it. They mapped its orbit. They described it as small, dense, and heavy, qualities now known to match its classification as a white dwarf. How could an oral culture, without metal or mathematics, know of an invisible star system only 8.6 light-years away? The answer offered is always the same: coincidence, misinterpretation, or modern contamination. But how many coincidences can a system bear before it begins to fracture? Perhaps the Dogon weren't alone. The Hopi speak of the ant people who sheltered them underground during the previous World Ages cataclysm. In Sumerian texts, we find the Apkallu, sages from the deep who brought civilization to humanity after the flood. In Vedic lore, the Nagas, half-human, half-serpent beings of wisdom, dwell beneath the earth and guard secret knowledge. Different names, same archetype. Are these merely projections of the collective unconscious? Or are they memories, distorted, refracted through millennia, like light through cracked obsidian? We must ask, what kind of intelligence reveals itself not in monuments of gold or conquest, but in the precision of a cut stone? In symbols buried and rediscovered, always too early, too complex? The farther back we go, the more we find civilizations seemingly emerging fully formed, with calendars, astronomy, metallurgy, agriculture, all within a few centuries. Too fast. As if knowledge had been reintroduced, not rediscovered. Linear progress does not explain this. Something else must. A transmission? A survival? And if so, then who or what was transmitting? There is a shadow behind history, not malevolent, not divine, but silent, watchful, intact. Maybe that's why these traces are so easily missed. They do not scream, they do not demand belief, they merely exist, waiting for those who choose to see. So why do we look away? Perhaps because what lies at the heart of this possibility is uncomfortable. The idea that we are not the apex of human story, but a recurrence. That our pride is misplaced, our timeline wrong. That we walk not toward progress, but in the footsteps of someone older and wiser. And yet, if they existed, they did not preserve themselves in palaces or treatises, but in the bones of mountains and the angles of stars. What kind of people would do that? What did they know about time, about survival, about us? Or maybe the real question is, why did they disappear? They say civilizations rise and fall, but what if one never fell, only stepped aside? Beneath the veil of history, beneath the dust of centuries, there are remnants, not shattered, not ruined, but absent, gone without destruction. As if a chapter had been turned, not torn. This is perhaps the most haunting question of all. What if the builders of those impossible monuments did not vanish in cataclysm, but withdrew? On the plains of the Indus, archaeologists unearthed the city of Mohenjo-Daro, streets laid out in precise grids, a complex drainage system rivaling those of modern times, granaries, public baths, standard weights. And yet no palaces, no temples, no kings' tombs, no armies, no clear signs of war or worship. Who organizes a society with such order and forgoes monuments to power? And then the mystery deepens. Around 1900 BCE, the city is abandoned, not burned, not sacked, simply left behind. Skeletons lie in the streets as if people dropped where they stood. Some of them show signs of radiation exposure, with levels of radioactivity that still puzzle investigators. There are theories, dismissed as fringe, mocked by the Academy, that some event, some energy, swept through that place. But the ruins do not speak of chaos, they whisper of cessation. It's not the only site. At Catalhoyuk, in Anatolia, older than any pyramid or ziggurat, The people built homes without streets, rooftops served as pathways, and there were no grand temples. Art, symbolism, murals of vultures and bulls and birthing scenes line the walls. A society without obvious hierarchy. Complex, symbolic, and yet no names remembered, no epic carved in stone, just the trace of an order different from ours. What if they were not primitive at all, but post-something? There are theories that challenge linear progression, that propose a cycle. Rise, fall, rise again. But not all rises are the same. The resurgence after forgetting is never a mirror of the original. It carries distortion, fragments, echoes. The things that don't quite fit, the myths, the symbols, the inexplicable motifs carved into stones the mainstream cannot explain, are the fingerprints left behind. In the Mahabharata, an ancient Indian epic, there are passages describing flying machines called vimanas, weapons that unleash fire brighter than 1,000 suns, cities turned to ash, people whose hair and nails fell out after exposure to an unknown force. Were these poetic flourishes, or memories too old for metaphor? Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, once quoted the Bhagavad Gita at the moment of detonation. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Later, in an interview, when asked if the Trinity test was the first nuclear explosion in history, he replied softly, "Well, yes, in modern times." Why did he say that? Why do we continue to encounter stories from India, from Sumer, from Egypt, from Mesoamerica, of gods who descend from the sky, of battles fought in heaven and on earth, of knowledge granted and then retracted? Perhaps they are not myths in the way we understand them. Perhaps they are compressed memories, cultural black boxes, encoded in poetry and preserved in ritual. But what happens when we forget the code? Then all we see are stories, fables, but the symbols persist. The spiral, the serpent, the star, the gate, found in petroglyphs, temples, tattoos, and dreams, as if seeded in the human mind, not as superstition, but as recall. There's a strange consistency in the archaeological record. Every time a high culture appears, it seems to arrive fully formed. Egypt doesn't slowly build towards the pyramids. It starts with them. The earliest pyramids are the most complex. As time goes on, the quality declines. The same with Sumerian writing. The earliest tablets show the highest sophistication. Later versions are cruder, simplified. This is not the curve of invention. It is the curve of memory. And memories, when they fade, become religion. The gods of ancient Egypt, the Neters, were not capricious beings of mythology. They were cosmic principles, aspects of reality, taught, not worshipped. Maat was not just a goddess, but the embodiment of truth, balance, order. Thoth was more than a scribe. He represented the logic of language, the frequency of thought. These were systems of understanding, not superstition. And yet today, we teach them as cartoons, as myths, as nonsense. Because somewhere along the way, we stopped listening. Or perhaps we were taught not to listen. If a civilization had survived some great upheaval, flood, fire, war, or cosmic event, and sought to preserve its knowledge, how would it do so? Books rot, machines corrode, but stone endures. And so they may have encoded their truths in monuments, myths, and mathematics. They may have scattered their story like seeds, waiting for fertile minds to grow them back into awareness. The real mystery is not whether such a race existed. It's whether we are ready to hear their voice, a voice that doesn't shout, that doesn't command, but hums softly in the background of time. Are we listening yet? A story forgotten is not the same as a story lost. Sometimes forgetting is a choice. We imagine history as a line, drawn cleanly from one era to the next, from caves to cities, from sticks to steel. But there are breaks in the line, ruptures, voids, silences too vast to ignore. The Younger Dryas, for instance, a sudden deep freeze around 1200 years ago. It lasted more than a millennium, then ended almost as abruptly as it began. We know the Earth changed in that time. Sea levels rose, climates shifted, entire species vanished. But what changed in us? Was that the first forgetting? Mainstream science speaks of the Younger Dryas as a climatic anomaly, possibly triggered by shifts in ocean currents or volcanic activity. But a growing body of evidence suggests another cause: impact. Fragments of a comet or asteroid striking Earth, igniting wildfires across continents, sending dust into the atmosphere and triggering global cooling. Meltwater pulses, floods, extinctions. This isn't science fiction. It's been studied. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has gained support from peer-reviewed research showing microspherules, platinum layers, and high concentrations of iridium, all indicators of an extraterrestrial event across more than 50 sites on multiple continents. What's harder to find is consensus, because accepting this would mean accepting a radical shift not just in geology, but in history. It would mean that any civilization existing before 10,800 BCE could have been wiped out nearly overnight. Could that explain the sudden appearance of advanced sites like Göbekli Tepe, which seems less like the beginning of something and more like an archive? Why do its builders seem obsessed with the sky, with animals arranged in celestial patterns, with enclosures that may mirror constellations frozen at specific dates in prehistory? Why did they go to such effort to preserve it, not for themselves, but for someone else? Someone like us? The ancients were not ignorant of catastrophe. Nearly every culture holds some version of a great deluge: the flood of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood of Manu in the Vedas, the flood of Deucalion in Greek lore, the flood of Nu'u in Polynesia, the flood of Noah in the Hebrew Bible. These are not moral allegories. They are memories, etched into the human psyche, repeating again and again across geography and language. Why would people separated by oceans and epochs tell the same story? And if they inherited that story, if they did not invent it but preserved it, then from whom? A people who watched the sky and knew the cycles, who tracked precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over 26,000 years, encoded in temples like those at Angkor Wat and the Great Sphinx, whose alignments only make sense when dated to a time far earlier than accepted by academic timelines. Why does the Sphinx face due east, where the sun rises during the spring equinox? Not today, but as it did around 10,500 BCE. The age of Leo? Why does erosion on the Sphinx suggest not wind, but water? Thousands of years of heavy rainfall that Egypt has not seen since before the Sahara became desert. Geologist Robert Schoch faced ridicule when he proposed this in the 1990s. He didn't speak in metaphors. He spoke in strata, sediment, weathering patterns. His conclusions pointed to a much older Egypt, not as the origin, but as the inheritor. The Sphinx wasn't built by Pharaoh Khafre. It was recarved, repurposed, its true makers long vanished or erased. Why would someone rewrite history so thoroughly? Control, perhaps. A narrative serves those who craft it. If civilization began in Mesopotamia and Egypt, then history belongs to kings, to priests, to empire. But if it began before, in the hands of a peaceful, advanced, anonymous culture, then the foundations of that authority tremble. Better to build monuments over older ones, to reshape forgotten knowledge into new dogma, to call the old gods myths, the old stones primitive, the old languages undecipherable. Because if we admit that something greater came before, we might be forced to ask, why did it end? And could it happen again? The possibility that we are not the first, not even the first to reach high civilization, changes everything. It reframes human history not as ascent, but as cycle. Not as miracle, but as memory. And memory is dangerous when awakened. It leads us to wonder, what else have we forgotten? Not just structures and names, but ways of knowing. Intuition, resonance, symbolic logic. The ability to read nature not as backdrop, but as language. A form of intelligence not obsessed with domination, but with integration. What if the ancients measured not just the physical, but the vibrational? What if their temples were not houses of worship, but instruments, designed to attune, to amplify, to align? Pythagoras believed the universe was made of numbers, that music and mathematics were bridges to the divine. He learned from Egyptian priests who guarded secrets said to be thousands of years old. They did not write these things down. They were passed in silence, protected. Because some truths are not meant to be shouted. They are meant to be found. And perhaps that's what we're doing now, rediscovering a puzzle long buried, scattered across continents, waiting to be pieced together again. But with every piece uncovered, the silence grows louder. And still the question lingers, quiet and insistent. What if our story didn't begin where we think it did? There's something unsettling about silence in the historical record. Not the natural kind, the silence of time and erosion, but the artificial kind, the kind that feels edited, chosen. When entire epochs go missing, we are told they were prehistory, as if the absence of writing justifies the absence of inquiry. But does ink alone define civilization? Or is that merely the boundary we've drawn, to avoid what lies beyond? There is a region in the Sahara known as Tassili Najjar. It is a plateau of stone, a fossilized sea of ancient life, where thousands of petroglyphs line the walls of caves, silent, immovable, still. They were drawn between 8,000 and 12,000 years ago, and they show something strange. Figures in helmets, figures with antennas, beings that seem to float, to descend, to commune. They are called the Roundheads, not quite human, not quite animal. Eyes too large, limbs elongated, often surrounded by smaller figures in supplication. Anthropologists interpret them as shamans or spiritual guides. But even those scholars admit there is something different here, something other. Some of the depictions look eerily modern, as though the past knew the future before it arrived. Could these have been visitors? Or are we looking at a symbolic record of something more internal? Perhaps the more unsettling possibility is that these were not depictions of gods, but of ancestors, that the ones we call aliens today were once kin, older, changed, hidden by time. This is not isolated. In Val Camonica, Italy, in Hunan, China, in the caves of Kimberley, Australia, the same motifs appear. Figures in radiating suits, round heads, beings surrounded by stars. Not always identical, but close enough to suggest commonality. And what do we do with this pattern? We file it under coincidence. But coincidence wears thin when it repeats across millennia and continents. We might ask, if these beings were imagined, why imagined the same way? If they were hallucinated, why with such consistency? And if they were remembered, then what were they? The dog figurines of Japan, dated to at least 10,000 years ago, resemble miniature astronauts, large-eyed, helmeted, jointed like they wore suits. Archaeologists classify them as fertility idols, an explanation that fits the framework, but not the form. How many fertility idols wear goggles? Why are we so eager to explain away, rather than explain? Maybe because the alternative forces us to ask whether something was here before us. Not gods, not myths, but beings. Beings with intelligence, with tools, with culture. Beings who left behind not their bodies, but echoes, in stone, in legend, in instinct. The serpent appears in almost every ancient tradition, not merely as animal, but as symbol. In Mesoamerican lore, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, descends from the stars, brings knowledge, departs with the promise to return. In Egypt, the serpent coils through time, encircling the sun bark of Ra. In the Vedas, Kundalini, the coiled serpent energy, sleeps at the base of the spine, waiting to awaken. Why a serpent? Why everywhere? Some say it is the spine, the DNA, the waveform, a symbol of hidden power. But what if it's more than symbol? What if it is memory, not of form, but of transmission? A pattern that once meant something beyond metaphor. There are stories that the ancients could see what we cannot, frequencies, energy fields, that they spoke in harmonics, built with resonance. The ancients didn't just carve stone, they sang to it. The monoliths at Stonehenge and Newgrange are not simply aligned with solstices, they are chambers of sound. Whisper in one corner, and it echoes across the bones. In Malta's Hypogem, a subterranean temple older than the pyramids, the oracle chamber vibrates at 110 hertz. A frequency that affects the human brain, stimulating parts associated with intuition and emotional processing. Visitors report strange dreams, visions, a sense of presence. Was this accidental? Or did someone understand the human mind better than we do now? Were these places temples or tuning devices? What kind of civilization designs with vibration? Not one concerned with walls and armies, not one obsessed with conquest, but one that valued states of being, states of mind. A people who understood the body not as a vessel, but as an instrument. One that could be tuned, awakened, aligned. Could that be why they left so little behind? Because their true legacy was not in stone, but in us? Perhaps they knew the cycles would return. That knowledge would be buried, not by disaster alone, but by design. That others, like us, would rise again, confused by fragments, haunted by the sense that something doesn't add up. Maybe that's why they carved certain things in stone, the bare minimum, symbols, alignments, frequencies. Not to teach, but to remind. And now the question falls to us. What are we remembering? Some ruins speak, others hum. In the highlands of Peru, a strange formation sits carved into a rock face, known as Puerta de Hayu Marca, the Gate of the Gods. It isn't a structure in the traditional sense. There are no inscriptions, no towering columns, no signs of dwelling, just a flat vertical wall, smoothed by ancient hands, and a recessed doorway leading nowhere. A door that opens into solid stone. The local legend tells of an Incan priest who fled Spanish conquerors, carrying a sacred golden disc, a key, they said, gifted by the gods. When he reached the gate, he placed the disc into a circular indentation at its center. The stone shimmered, opened like mist. He stepped through and vanished. Of course, we're told that's just a story. But why build a door that doesn't lead to anything? And why do similar false doors appear across the ancient world, in Egypt, in Malta, in India, and even at Göbekli Tepe? They do not open, yet they remain. Perhaps they weren't meant to be opened with hands. What if the ancients believed that some thresholds didn't require walls to cross, only consciousness? That certain places acted as points of transition, not between rooms, but between states? In Egypt, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, what we call the Book of the Dead, is not a manual for burial. It's a guidebook for the soul's journey through the duat, the hidden world. It maps trials, gates, and guardians, not metaphorically, but cartographically, as if the Egyptians saw death not as an ending, but as a migration, a transition to another layer of reality, navigable, structured, real. Modern physics speaks of dimensions, strings vibrating across membranes. Realities stacked beside ours, invisible only because we lack the senses or tools to see them. Are the two ideas so different? Could those ancient gates have been more than symbolic? Many of the world's most sacred sites are built atop geological anomalies, places where magnetic fields shift, where underground water flows, where resonance is naturally amplified. Did the ancients sense this? Did they know how to harness it? The Great Pyramid at Giza is not just an architectural wonder, it is an instrument. Its internal chambers, proportions, and orientation align with precision to celestial bodies, acoustic frequencies, and magnetic fields. The King's Chamber resonates at 440 Hz, the same as the standard tuning pitch for musical instruments today. Its granite walls, dense with quartz, respond to vibration like a bell. What was its purpose? Not tomb? No body was ever found inside. Could it have been a chamber for transformation? Were the initiates not buried there but changed? And if the pyramid was an initiatory device, who designed it? Mainstream Egyptology credits the pharaoh Khufu, based on a handful of red ochre marks found in a small upper cavity. But no inscription inside the pyramid claims authorship. No depiction of its construction exists. In fact, many of the oldest structures in Egypt lack any narrative of their own making, almost as if they came before narrative, before language, before memory. Perhaps these monuments were already ancient when history began recording. In the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, carvings show what appear to be oversized bulbs, glass-like shapes emitting energy, held by figures standing calmly, as if in ritual. Cables, lotus stems, snakes coiling within. Scholars call them religious symbols. But what if they were diagrams of something once known and then buried? Even the mythology surrounding these temples speaks of cycles, not centuries, but tens of thousands of years. The Egyptians believed in Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age when gods walked among humans, when Ma'at, the principle of balance, reigned. They said that after Zep Tepi came decline, separation, forgetting, And yet, Zeb Tepe was never taught as fiction. It was recorded as history. A history older than dynasties, older than writing. So why was it dismissed? Why are all these patterns, the out-of-place artifacts, the over-engineered ruins, the impossible alignments, treated as noise? Could it be that we fear what they suggest? Not that aliens built the pyramids, but that humans did, once, before we became what we are now. That our ancestors, far from primitive, understood something we no longer remember. Something about frequency, consciousness, cycles of time. What if our greatness isn't ahead of us, but behind? And if that's true, then who preserved the echoes? Who placed the gates in stone? Who encoded the resonance in chambers and caves? Not to be worshipped, not to be deciphered, but to be felt when we were ready. Perhaps that readiness begins with doubt, with the willingness to see a doorway where others see only a wall, and to ask, what happens if we step through? The deeper we dig, the older things become. But sometimes what we uncover isn't just old, it's out of place. There is a term in archaeology, upart, out-of-place artifact. It refers to objects that seem too advanced, too anomalous for their assigned context. Tools buried in coal seams millions of years old. Carvings that resemble airplanes, discovered in tombs predating known flight by thousands of years. Maps from the 16th century showing Antarctica's coastline free of ice, something only satellite imaging confirmed in the 20th century. The Piri Reis map is one such case. Drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, it charts the Atlantic coastline with uncanny accuracy, parts of South America, Africa, and Antarctica. The precision is baffling. The curvature of the Earth is accounted for. Some coastlines depicted were still covered in ice until at least 4000 BCE. And yet, Rice himself claimed he had compiled it from much older source maps, ones now lost or hidden. What kind of civilization could have drawn such maps before the last ice age ended? Mainstream historians shrug and say, coincidence, miscopying, misinterpretation. But the pattern persists. In India's sacred city of Dwarka, long believed to be mythological, underwater explorations uncovered submerged structures, roads, and walls off the coast of Gujarat. Radiocarbon dating suggests the ruins are over 9,000 years old, older than any known city. And yet it barely made headlines. Why does our history resist these findings? There is something almost defensive in the way new data is handled, as though the past must remain fixed, even when evidence shifts beneath it. But what if the discomfort doesn't come from the age of these discoveries, but from what they imply? That there was a time before our time, a people before our people, a history before history. And if they existed, where did they go? Some point to cataclysm, the Younger Dryas impact, the rising seas that swallowed Doggerland, Sunderland, the Beringia land bridge. The memory of these floods persists in myth, but also in geology. We know the oceans rose 400 feet in the span of a few thousand years. Entire continents were submerged. Coastlines vanished. Mountains became islands. How much of civilization drowned with them? Today, over 95% of archaeological sites remain undiscovered, most of them likely beneath the seas. If cities once stood on continental shelves now underwater, their remains would lie hidden beneath layers of silt, coral, and time, beyond the reach of casual exploration, beyond visibility. What stories are locked in those depths? In the Caribbean, sonar scans have revealed what some believe to be stepped pyramids off the coast of Cuba. Near Japan, the submerged terraces of Yonaguni raise the same questions: cuts too straight, angles too precise, alignments too deliberate. Yet again, we're told natural formations. Why does the benefit of doubt always favor ignorance? There is another possibility: that these sites were not destroyed by nature, but abandoned by choice. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Quiche Maya, the first humans were made from mud, then wood, then maize. But the ones made of wood, intelligent, strong, yet lacking soul, were destroyed in a great flood. Those who survived became monkeys, or perhaps something worse: shadows. What kind of memory gives rise to such a myth? Did the ancients encode genetic memory and story? Did they remember not just survival, but failure? Could it be that the ancient race we seek did not perish in disaster, but turned away from the path we're now walking? That they saw where it led and chose silence instead? Some traditions speak of the Watchers. In the Book of Enoch, they were angels who descended to earth, shared knowledge with humans, astronomy, metallurgy, root cutting, and were punished for it. In Sumerian lore, the Anunnaki descended from the heavens, guided civilization, then withdrew. In Hopi legends, the Kachinas came from the sky, taught the people, then promised to return. The names differ, the pattern does not. Beings who came, who taught, who left. And always a promise or a warning. Why do we reduce them to fantasy? Is it safer to call them myths than to consider they were real? That we are the descendants of a broken dialogue? Maybe the ancients didn't just leave behind architecture. Maybe they left behind questions, riddles wrapped in stone and myth, waiting. Not because they wanted to be remembered, but because they wanted us to remember ourselves. Not just our names, but our origins, our possibilities, our patterns. Because perhaps they knew something we don't. That civilizations rise not by tools, but by wisdom, and fall not from weakness, but from forgetting. So the question remains: are we remembering in time? There are things we no longer question, not because they're proven, but because they're comfortable. One of them is the idea that time moves forward in a straight line, that knowledge accumulates uninterrupted, that we are the culmination of every triumph, every failure. But what if time isn't linear? What if it moves in rhythms, not unlike breath or tides or the turning of stars? The ancients didn't track time the way we do. They didn't reduce it to seconds or spreadsheets. They spoke of yugas, ages, suns, vast cycles spanning thousands, even millions of years. The Mayans calculated the length of their long count calendar to over 5,000 years. The Vedic texts stretch further, describing the Kali Yuga, the age of forgetting, as the last and darkest in a cycle that repeats. Why build a calendar that measures time beyond the lifespan of any known civilization? What were they measuring? And more importantly, what were they waiting for? In Cambodia's Angkor Wat, the temple walls do more than tell religious stories. They chart astronomical precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over a 26,000-year cycle. A cycle also mirrored in the Dendera zodiac of ancient Egypt, in the myths of the Hopi, the Dogon, the Olmec, separated by oceans, united in celestial memory. This isn't coincidence, it's inheritance. But from whom? We're taught that such precision was accidental, that without telescopes or computers, ancient people simply guessed and somehow aligned megaliths, temples, and entire cities with solstices, equinoxes, and constellations. But what if the sky wasn't mystery to them? What if it was memory? The Great Year, a term revived by Plato, refers to this precessional cycle. He said the world undergoes periodic destruction and renewal in harmony with it. He also spoke of Atlantis, a place of great knowledge and hubris, a civilization that fell in a single day and night of misfortune. Scholars say Plato was just drawing allegory, but he insisted it was history, passed to him by Egyptian priests. And even today, submerged structures, like those near Bimini Road in the Bahamas, continue to tease the imagination. Blocks, platforms, alignments, not quite natural, not quite explained. Are these the bones of Atlantis, or just more remnants of something older? Atlantis may be just a name. What matters is what it represents: a lost memory, a fracture in the timeline, a warning embedded in story. Because every golden age ends, and every decline begins with forgetting. Forgetting how to read the stars, forgetting how to listen to the earth, forgetting what it means to be human. But maybe that forgetting isn't permanent. Maybe it's seasonal. In the Andes, the legend of Viracocha tells of a bearded figure, tall, pale, cloaked, who emerged after a great flood and taught the people agriculture, astronomy, building. He brought order, then walked across the water and disappeared. Sound familiar? It should. The same archetype appears across cultures. Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Oannes in Babylon, Osiris in Egypt. The white gods, who came not with swords, but with knowledge. Are they the same being, the same memory, the same story told in different tongues? Or were they the emissaries of a race older than we dare admit? Some suggest these figures were survivors, refugees from a lost civilization, carriers of forgotten truths. They weren't worshipped as gods until memory decayed into myth. But before that, they were teachers, bridges between worlds. So where did they go? Perhaps they never left. Perhaps they are not in the sky, but in our bones, in the structures of our myths, in the geometry of sacred sites, in the genetic echoes that science is only beginning to unravel. Why do so many ancient traditions speak of star ancestors? Why do DNA studies continue to reveal anomalies, sudden leaps, unexplained variations, fragments with no known origin? Science struggles to place these within neat evolutionary charts. But what if evolution isn't just physical? What if it's cyclical? The ancients spoke of enlightenment not as a belief, but as a return, a remembering of what we once were and what we might be again. So perhaps the ancient race we seek isn't separate from us. Perhaps they are the deeper layer, dormant, waiting, like seed beneath frost. The temples, the myths, the star maps, they are not just remnants. They are invitations. And now that we've begun to look again, to question again, the signal grows louder. But to hear it, we must be willing to let go of certainty, to sit in the silence between stories, to ask the question few dare speak aloud. What if we are not the beginning? Beneath the noise of modern life, beneath the hum of data and speed, there lingers a quiet question, almost imperceptible, like something heard in a dream but forgotten by morning. Where did we truly begin? Not as individuals, but as a species, not as a date in a textbook, but as a lineage of memory, soul, and intelligence. The answer, it seems, may not lie in what we've built, but in what we've lost. In South Africa, deep within the rocks of the Barberton Greenstone Belt, among the oldest geological formations on Earth, lie traces of human activity far older than the current model of civilization allows. Michael Tellinger, controversial yet persistent, points to circular stone structures, numbering in the thousands, scattered across the landscape. Some are connected by pathways. Some align with star constellations. Some seem to resonate with vibrational frequencies when struck. Mainstream scholars date them to a few hundred years ago, attributing them to cattle enclosures built by local tribes. But the erosion patterns, the wear on the stone, and their celestial arrangements hint at something older, much older. Tellinger calls them the remnants of an ancient energy grid, a civilization built not on fuel or fire, but on frequency. It sounds absurd until you look again, until you see that these patterns, stone circles, spiral alignments, energy nodes, mirror others found across the globe, in Britain, in Malta, in Peru, in India. Not the same culture, but the same idea. That Earth itself is a living grid, and that the ancients may have understood how to interact with it, not by conquering, but by harmonizing. What kind of people build with resonance? What kind of people use stone not for walls, but for tuning? In modern science, we're beginning to understand that all matter is vibration. That frequency affects not only sound, but structure, water, emotion, even DNA. The work of Dr. Masaru Emoto, though contested, showed that water crystals change form depending on the words and emotions directed at them. Cymatics, the study of visible sound vibrations, reveals geometric patterns forming in sand and liquid when exposed to specific frequencies. These aren't just curiosities, they're keys. Keys to understanding how a civilization might build temples that heal, spaces that alter consciousness, monuments that do not declare power but invite presence. And perhaps this is why they left so little behind in the way of weapons or monuments to conquest. Because they weren't trying to control the world. They were listening to it. They were in conversation with stone, sky, silence. Compare that with today. We race forward, obsessed with speed, with extraction, with dominance. We treat nature as a thing to be subdued. We forget that knowledge is not always noisy, that wisdom often arrives in stillness. And in that forgetting, we overlook what the ancient ones tried to preserve. Their knowledge wasn't written in books. It was embedded in form, encoded in number, whispered in the proportions of temples, the rhythms of chants, the cycles of the stars. Why do the measurements of ancient sites repeat so precisely? The base of the Great Pyramid encodes pi and the golden ratio. The distance between Stonehenge and other megalithic sites reveals an understanding of longitude and latitude far beyond its time. Angkor Wat mirrors the Draco constellation, not as it appears now, but as it did thousands of years ago. Coincidence, we are told. Always coincidence. But a coincidence repeated enough becomes a pattern, and a pattern denied becomes a warning. Because maybe we're not just forgetting something old. Maybe we're ignoring something vital. That we are part of a larger structure. That civilization, like consciousness, is not something we built, but something we tuned into, like a frequency long lost, until now. When we stare at these ancient places, when we walk among the stones, the carvings, the ruins, we often feel something, a sensation difficult to explain, a pressure behind the eyes, a ringing in the ears, a presence that cannot be measured, only felt. Is it awe, or is it recognition? Are we remembering? Perhaps the reason we don't find definitive proof of this ancient race is because they didn't want to be found the way we expect. Not through bones, not through machines, but through resonance, through awakening. What if they understood that truth, when spoken too directly, becomes dogma, but when encoded in mystery, becomes a path only those ready to ask would ever find. And now, as more awaken to the gaps in the official story, the questions are beginning to rise. Not loudly, not with rage, but quietly, patiently, like something that has waited a very long time to be heard. So we ask again, what if we didn't invent civilization? What if we inherited it? There is a kind of silence that surrounds certain questions, not the silence of mystery, but of discomfort. The kind of silence that forms when something brushes too close to the boundary of what we're allowed to remember. Take, for instance, the story of the Dropa Stones. In the 1930s, deep within the Bayan-Karaula mountains of China, archaeologists claimed to have uncovered a series of burial caves. Inside were skeletal remains, frail, humanoid, with unusually large skulls. Alongside them, they found hundreds of stone discs. Each was perfectly circular, with a hole in the center, and delicate spiral grooves etched into the surface. Grooves that, under magnification, revealed microscopic carvings, symbols, writing. The discs were dismissed at first, declared ceremonial, ornamental, even meaningless. But decades later, researchers attempted to translate the inscriptions. They allegedly told the story of a people, the Dropa, who came from the stars, crash-landed on Earth, and could not return. They made peace with the local tribes, shared knowledge, lived, died, and were buried. It sounds unbelievable, and perhaps it is. But what's strange isn't the claim, it's how quickly it was buried. The discs disappeared into museum basements. The academics involved recanted or vanished from record. The official narrative declared it a hoax, despite never producing the discs for public analysis. And just like that, silence. We are told to forget, but stories like these don't vanish. They linger, repeating in different cultures under different names. In the mountains of Tibet, texts speak of star beings, the Kundalini, who arrived in metal dragons from the sky. In the Zulu traditions of southern Africa, the Chitauri are described as serpent-like sky visitors who once ruled over humans until they were overthrown. In Australia, the Wandjina, cloud beings, are depicted in Aboriginal cave art, with round heads, dark eyes, and no mouths. They came from the sky, created the land, then withdrew into sacred places, promising to return. These myths are never isolated. They cross cultures, oceans, and time, repeating with eerie consistency, not always in content, but in form, in tone, in the lingering suggestion that Earth was once a meeting place, a convergence. But the question remains, if such a race existed, ancient, advanced, other, where are they now? Some believe they left. Others say they moved underground, becoming part of the Earth's hidden structure. The concept of subterranean civilizations is not new. From Agartha in Tibetan lore, to Patala in Hindu texts, to the Hopi's inner world. The idea of beings retreating into the earth after a cataclysm is old, widespread, and persistent. But what if they didn't go anywhere? What if they changed form? What if the evolution of consciousness doesn't always move outward, but inward? We assume intelligence must look like ours, must build, expand, conquer. But what if a truly advanced species wouldn't leave behind cities, but frequencies? Not monuments, but memories, embedded not in stone, but in the human mind. Carl Jung once spoke of the collective unconscious, a deep, shared reservoir of symbols, archetypes, truths we carry without knowing. But where do those symbols come from? Why do so many ancient people speak of dreams as sacred? Why were vision quests, trance states, and oracles treated not as superstition, but as access? Access to what? We now know the pineal gland, long associated with the third eye, contains structures similar to those in the human eye. It produces melatonin, responds to light, and is sensitive to electromagnetic fields. Ancient traditions spoke of it as the seat of the soul, the gate to other realms. Science calls it a vestigial feature. But what if it's a remnant of a kind of perception we once had, and lost? Maybe the ancient race wasn't meant to be found with shovels, but with stillness. Maybe they live in the spaces between thought, in the silence behind the eyes, where language falls away and symbols remain. This isn't just philosophy. Studies in neuroscience are beginning to show that altered states, achieved through meditation, sound, or sacred plants, can unlock brain patterns that mirror those found in deep ancestral memory. Not hallucinations, but recollections. If the ancients knew this, it would explain much. Why they built temples that resonate. Why they used chants, mantras, drumming, not as art, but as tools. To change state, to remember. So perhaps the Dropa didn't disappear. Perhaps Atlantis never sank. Perhaps Zep Tepe wasn't a place, but a condition, a vibration we've forgotten how to reach. And now, as we stand at the edge of our own forgetting, with technology rising but wisdom dimming, their whispers grow louder. Not in the sky, not in ruins, but in us, waiting to be heard once more. We often think of progress as upward motion, a ladder, each rung higher than the last. But what if it's more like a spiral, returning again and again to the same point, but from a new angle? This is not how we've been taught to think about civilization. The model we inherit is clear. Hunter-gatherers, agriculture, villages, cities, writing, law, science, all clean, all ascending. But there are things that don't fit that path. Fragments, footprints that go sideways or backward. In 1994, inside the Chauvet Cave of southern France, explorers found paintings so sophisticated they shocked the academic world. Horses, lions, bears, rhinos, all rendered in fluid motion, with depth, shading, and subtlety no one expected from Paleolithic humans. They were dated to over 30,000 years ago. 30,000. These weren't crude scrawls. They were expressions, intentional, stylized, deliberate, and they were hidden, not displayed on cave entrances, but deep inside the earth, accessible only through narrow passages, as if the art wasn't meant to be seen, but to be felt or remembered. Why does that matter? Because it challenges the assumption that early humans were cognitively undeveloped, that they were merely surviving. But this kind of art, abstract, symbolic, emotionally complex, suggests something else. A way of seeing the world we no longer understand. A mind not fixated on survival, but on connection. And this is the pattern. The deeper we go, the stranger things become. There's a site in North America, Poverty Point in Louisiana, often overlooked in world history. A massive earthen complex composed of concentric ridges, mounds, and geometric arrangements. Built nearly 3,500 years ago, It shows clear knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. But here's the puzzle. No evidence of agriculture, no permanent housing, no signs of hierarchy or warfare. Just a sprawling, deliberate design from a culture labeled archaic. How does a society with no centralized authority move 30 million pounds of earth with such precision? What compelled them to do so? No one can explain it, so it's quietly ignored. And yet, it fits the same pattern seen across the planet. Advanced knowledge without infrastructure, sacred geometry without empire, symbolic alignment without conquest. Maybe they weren't building for the eyes. Maybe they were building for memory. Ancient cultures seemed obsessed with placement. Temples aligned with stars, stones set at solstice angles, cities laid out in correspondence with constellations. But why? Was it purely for ritual? Or were they mapping something, preserving something? There is a theory, one that mainstream academia rejects, but which continues to return like a low hum, that ancient structures were part of a global system. Not political, not economic, but energetic. Nodes in a network, positioned along what some call ley lines, invisible currents that crisscross the Earth. It sounds mystical. Until you realize modern science is now beginning to understand Earth's telluric currents, natural electric and magnetic flows that affect everything from weather to brain activity. Certain minerals, particularly quartz and granite, amplify these effects. And these are the very materials found in the foundations of many ancient sites. Coincidence again? Or design? And then there's the acoustics. Studies have shown that many ancient temples, chambers, and monuments resonate at frequencies between 90 and 120 Hz, precisely the range that alters human brain waves into theta states, associated with meditation, dreaming, and deep intuition. Why would cultures with no known musical notation build spaces that function as tuning forks for the mind? Who taught them? Or what did they remember? These aren't isolated anomalies. They are scattered signals, pieces of a language we've forgotten how to speak. And when we gather them together, a shape begins to emerge. Not a timeline, but a pulse. Not a civilization, but a consciousness. Perhaps the ancient race we seek didn't fall from grace. Perhaps it slipped out of phase. If they understood that matter, energy, and thought are not separate, but braided, then perhaps they reached a threshold. One we can't see because we're still looking for ruins. But maybe the real ruins are in us. In our forgetting. In the way we look at the sky now with satellites, but no stories. In the way we touch the earth with machines, but not with reverence. Perhaps that's why they left behind patterns, not paragraphs. Because some truths aren't told. They're triggered, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. So the next time you stand inside a stone circle, or walk among forgotten mounds, or feel something stir beneath ancient glyphs, pause. It might not be imagination. It might be a memory trying to return. There are places in the world that feel different. Not because of what stands there now, but because of what once did. Places that vibrate with a stillness too deep for coincidence. You can't quite name it. You only feel it. As if time folds more tightly in those spaces. As if memory, long buried, begins to rise like heat from stone. One such place is Nan Madol. Floating off the eastern shore of Pohnpei in Micronesia, this megalithic complex is unlike anything else on Earth. A series of nearly 100 artificial islets built from massive basalt columns, some weighing over 50 tons, arranged into walls, platforms, tombs, and canals. The entire structure appears to hover on the sea, like the ruins of a forgotten Venice carved by giants. No written record exists explaining who built Nan Madol or why. Local legends speak of twin sorcerers who summoned the stones through chant and flight. Some oral traditions claim the city was once the seat of a powerful empire, one that ruled not just Micronesia, but extended across distant oceans. Archaeologists, uncertain, suggest it was built beginning around 1200 CE, but the structure's complexity and the logistical impossibility of moving and stacking those stones without cranes or mortar has sparked questions no one can fully answer. How do you move 100,000 tons of volcanic rock across tidal waters with no draft animals and no wheels? Why build such an immense stone city in the middle of the ocean, far from major land masses? And why does it echo, in eerie silence, the layout of other sacred waterbound cities? Atlantis, Tiahuanaco, Dwarka, all submerged or half-sunken, all tied to ancient floods, all dismissed with a shrug. What if Nan Madol isn't an isolated marvel, but a surviving node? Part of a greater pattern? Civilizations tend to cluster near rivers, valleys, and trade routes, but the megalithic world doesn't obey that rule. Its great works appear in hard-to-reach places, across deserts, mountaintops, and islands. They are placed not for utility, but for orientation. To what? Many are aligned not just with the cardinal directions, but with specific stars: Sirius, Orion, the Pleiades, the same stars that appear again and again in myth, as homes of the gods, as origin points. Why those stars? Why those same names? Even today, the Pleiades are central to dozens of indigenous cosmologies. The Maori call them Matariki. The Japanese call them Subaru. In Greek lore, they are the Seven Sisters. In Mayan codices, they are linked to the calendar, the planting of maize, the renewal of cycles. The Dogon, again, claimed their ancestors came from Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye. We dismiss this with cultural filters: myth, metaphor, coincidence. But metaphor doesn't explain precision. Myth doesn't build with 50-ton stones. And coincidence, when repeated across cultures and millennia, begins to feel less like chance and more like memory. Perhaps these sites are not monuments to the past, but signposts for something still to come. Or return, because what if this ancient race, this predecessor civilization, wasn't destroyed in the way we think? What if it fractured? Split across the world, scattered into isolated pockets, its memory fading in some places, surviving in others, encoded in symbols, structures, and stories? And what if some fragments never forgot? We often overlook the Amazon in our search for ancient civilization. Dense, green, impenetrable, it's been treated as a blank canvas. But recent LiDAR scans have revealed something startling beneath the canopy: a network of cities, grids, causeways, pyramids, entire urban complexes, long swallowed by jungle. Some are over 2,000 years old, some may be far older. They suggest that the Amazon was not untouched wilderness, but cultivated, gardened, by a sophisticated people whose footprint has only now begun to re-emerge. Why were they erased? Why is so much of their legacy invisible, not just physically, but culturally? Could it be that their philosophy stood at odds with ours? A culture not of consumption, but of balance. Not of noise, but of signal. And if that's true, then the question changes. It's not just, where did they go? It's, What did they leave for us? Because what they left may not be found in tombs or texts, but in the design of reality itself. In patterns, harmonics, proportions, in the way sacred geometry repeats in nature, in the spiral of a galaxy, the swirl of a shell, the branching of lungs and lightning. These aren't decorations. They're signatures. And they're everywhere. Embedded in our art, our architecture, our cells, waiting to be remembered. But only when we are ready to see without expectation, to feel without explanation, to know without proof. Perhaps that readiness is why this knowledge returns now, in dreams, in doubts, in the spaces between questions. Not with authority, but with invitation. Not to tell us who we are, but to remind us of what we already knew. And now the echo grows louder. What if the race we seek isn't gone? What if it's sleeping inside us? Some memories don't live in words. They linger in symbols, in dreams, in the quiet pull we feel toward certain places. Ancient ruins, forgotten songs, patterns drawn in the sand. They stir something deep. Not in the mind, but in the marrow. Across the earth, from the highlands of Scotland to the temples of Cambodia, the spiral appears. Etched into stone, carved into bone, painted onto cave walls thousands of years apart. Always the same form, winding inward or expanding outward, an eternal motion. Not just decoration, but intention. What were they trying to show us? The spiral is not just art, it is math. It's found in galaxies, hurricanes, sunflower seeds, and DNA. It speaks to motion without beginning or end, growth without violence. Many traditions say it represents the path of the soul, or the unfolding of time. What if it's more than symbol? What if it was left behind by a people who understood not only the shape of nature, but how to move within it? In Malta, the Hal Saflieni hypogeum, a subterranean structure over 5,000 years old, is lined with spiral motifs. It was carved into limestone with bone and stone tools, yet its chambers still produce near-perfect acoustic resonance. One chamber, the so-called oracle room, vibrates at a frequency of 111 Hz, known to stimulate the brain's prefrontal cortex and induce trance states. This was not accident. Whoever built this space understood sound, resonance, and human consciousness. They weren't just honoring the dead, they were transforming the living. But where did that knowledge go? The builders left no name, no language, no record. Just stone and sound, like so many others before them. Perhaps that's how they chose to speak. Modern science has only recently begun to confirm what the ancients may have always known, that sound affects matter, that frequency organizes form. Through cymatics, we see how vibration can create complex, stable patterns in sand and water, spirals, hexagons, fractals, geometry, born from tone. Now imagine a civilization that didn't just observe this, but lived by it. A people who built cities not to dominate, but to harmonize, where every structure, every path, every stone was placed not by ruler, but by rhythm, where knowledge didn't need to be written because it could be felt. What kind of mind would that require? One not fragmented by distraction or dominance, but quiet, attuned. Is it possible that this is why we find no tools, no machines, no scripts in many megalithic sites? Not because these people were primitive, but because they worked in a different paradigm, one we no longer recognize? In the Andes, the massive stones of Sacsayhuaman fit together with impossible precision. No mortar, no gaps, Not even a blade of grass can slip between them. The stones are irregular, like a puzzle, yet seem melted into place. Some researchers suggest ancient builders may have used sound to soften or manipulate stone. A lost technique, perhaps once common, now gone. Not magic, not myth, just forgotten technology. Was this the inheritance of an older race? Or their signature? And then there's the question of the builders themselves. In nearly every corner of the world, we find myths of giants, not always literal, but often described as taller, stronger, more capable than current humans. The Nephilim of the Hebrew Bible, the Anakim, the Titans of Greece, the Daityas of India, the Viracocha of Peru, beings who arrived in a time before time and helped shape the world. We're told these are metaphors, but what if they're memories? Fossils of oversized human-like skeletons have been reported for centuries, often dismissed or discredited. Yet newspaper archives from the 19th and early 20th centuries contain dozens of reports. Femurs 4 feet long, skulls with double rows of teeth, entire skeletons buried in mounds across North America, only to disappear into museum vaults or private collections. Too inconsistent to be trusted, but too numerous to ignore. And always, silence follows. Perhaps the greatest mystery isn't the presence of anomalies. It's the effort to erase them, to deny the memory. Why? Because if such beings once walked the earth, if they passed down knowledge, seeded cities, encoded meaning into myth, then our view of history collapses. Sumer is no longer the beginning. Egypt is no longer the model. And we are no longer the pinnacle, but the continuation. The thread woven into a much older tapestry. A lineage not of conquest, but of contact. And if we are their descendants, not by blood, but by awareness, then we are also their keepers, carriers of a dormant inheritance, waiting to be reawakened. Not through books, not through belief, but through resonance, through remembrance. Because maybe the spiral isn't a symbol at all. Maybe it's an instruction, a map leading us back, not to the past, but to a frequency long buried beneath the static of our forgetting. And now, in this moment of global noise, we are beginning to hear its quiet call once more. Not through proof, but through presence, through the sense that we are not alone and never have been. Sometimes the oldest truths are hidden in plain sight, not buried under earth, but beneath assumption, accepted, repeated, unchallenged, not because they're proven, but because they're comfortable. Take language. We're told that writing began in Sumer around 3200 BCE. That before that, humans grunted, painted, and prayed, but did not write. That cuneiform tablets marked the beginning of recorded thought. And yet we forget. Language does not begin with writing. Writing is only the residue of something already living. Before ink, before clay, there was symbol. And symbols, we now know, go back far further than Sumer. Across Europe, in the caves of Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira, places sealed for tens of thousands of years, researchers have catalogued repeating marks. Not just animals or handprints, but abstract signs. Crosses, zigzags, spirals, ladder shapes, dots, almost 26 of them, appearing again and again across vast distances and time periods. Archaeologist Genevieve von Petzinger has suggested these signs may represent the earliest known symbolic language, a proto-script. If true, it means that Paleolithic humans weren't just drawing, they were encoding, communicating. leaving messages that outlived memory. And these symbols, they persist. They echo in petroglyphs across continents, reappearing in Aboriginal Australia, the Americas, the Arctic. Sometimes carved in rock, sometimes woven into textiles, sometimes hidden in temple walls. Always the same forms, always charged with meaning, even when forgotten. What were they trying to tell us? Perhaps language, in its earliest form, was not about description, but about activation. Not just to inform, but to resonate, to remind. The ancients spoke of words as power, of names as essence. In Egypt, to know the true name of a thing was to hold it. In Hebrew, the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, was considered unutterable, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Sound, symbol, breath. They weren't separate. They were gateways. And even today, some of that memory lingers. In Sanskrit, every syllable is said to carry vibration, not just meaning, but energy. Om is not a word, but a frequency, the sound of creation itself. In Tibetan tradition, mantras are carved into stones and placed in water to bless the current. In Islamic calligraphy, the name of God is not painted for beauty, but as a reflection of divine structure. What if writing was never meant to be read, but felt? In 1909, a strange story appeared in an Arizona newspaper. Explorer G.E. Kincaid claimed to have discovered a vast cave complex in the Grand Canyon, filled with Egyptian-style artifacts, hieroglyphics, and statues. The Smithsonian allegedly investigated, then went silent. The entrance has never been found again. Officially, it was dismissed as fabrication. But whispers remain. Could there be sites, scripts, entire chapters of history hidden in the last places we'd expect? Under mountains, beneath oceans, inside forbidden archives? Why is it that so many early scripts appear fully formed, with complex syntax, grammar, and structure, as if they emerged from nowhere? Linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoans, the Rongorongo glyphs of Easter Island, the Indus Valley script, still unread, no slow evolution, just sudden appearance, sophisticated, precise, then gone. And why do so many of these scripts resemble each other, despite geography? Is it coincidence or common ancestry? A lost progenitor language? The concept isn't new. Some linguists have proposed a proto-world language, a theoretical mother tongue from which all modern languages descend. Critics dismiss it as impossible to prove. But the idea persists, because buried within the lexicons of seemingly unrelated cultures are root words that feel familiar, as if the human mouth remembers something the mind has forgotten. Even the word mantra, found in Sanskrit, echoes in other traditions. Matra in Egyptian, meaning measure or wisdom. Mantis in Greek, prophet. Manna in Polynesian cultures, spiritual power. Not identical, but close. Too close. Maybe that's why sacred language was always sung, not spoken. Why the Psalms were chanted. Why Gregorian monks used tone and breath to open the heart. Why shamans across the world enter trance not through talk, but through sound. Perhaps the ancients knew that to speak was not merely to label reality, but to shape it. We lost that. Replaced tone with noise, meaning with definition, essence with instruction. But sometimes, even now, we feel it again. In a poem, in a lullaby, in a word spoken softly in the dark that seems to stir something beneath thought. Something older than logic. Something that doesn't explain, but reminds. The symbols left by the ancient race, in stone, in cave, in chant, may not be puzzles to decode, but songs waiting to be heard. Not for the ears, but for the inner architecture of mind and memory. And that would explain why they endure, why no one can erase them, why they return again and again, in dreams, in trance, in children's scribbles and visionary art. Because perhaps we were never meant to forget, only to remember when we were ready. And now, as our machines grow louder, as our screens fill with empty noise, something else hums beneath it all. Waiting. Not to be read, but to be felt. A forgotten tongue. Calling us home. We search for our origins in layers of dirt and fragments of pottery, as if truth could be pieced back together like a broken vase. But what if the truth isn't buried? What if it's encoded, not in the earth, but in the human body? There's something ancient within us. A residue, a rhythm, a whisper that surfaces in dreams or in moments of deep stillness. Not a memory, but a familiarity. As if we are not the first to walk this path, but the latest in a long line of forgotten returns. Modern genetics has opened doors our ancestors never imagined. We can trace ancestry, map migration, isolate mutations. And yet, for all the precision of DNA, there are patterns we don't understand, anomalies we don't talk about, like the 223 genes in the human genome that seem to have no clear evolutionary trail. Genes found in bacteria, but not in any creature between them and us. How did they get there? Some scientists suggest horizontal gene transfer, a process common in microbes but rarely observed in complex organisms. Others shrug, calling it a mystery yet to be solved. But for those willing to peer through a wider lens, another question arises. Could they be remnants? Gifts? Leftovers from a contact long ago by a people, or beings, whose biology wasn't so different from ours? Ancient traditions speak of gods who shaped humanity not from clay, but from their own essence. In Sumerian lore, the Anunnaki are said to have mixed their blood with that of primitive hominids to create the first humans. In Genesis, we read that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. In the Popol Vuh, the gods attempted several prototypes of mankind, from mud, from wood, and finally from maize. Always the story is the same. Humanity was made, not evolved, formed with intention, engineered. Is that why we appear so suddenly in the fossil record? Is that why, after hundreds of thousands of years of stone tools and slow change, we suddenly, in a geological instant, begin building, speaking, writing, organizing? The Great Leap Forward, as evolutionary biologists call it, is a mystery. A burst of cognitive and cultural complexity that still defies neat explanation. Art, burial, symbolic thought, language, all emerging within a span of millennia. A blink in cosmic time. What happened? Did something awaken in us? Or were we awakened? There's an unsettling possibility that civilization is not a natural byproduct of human evolution, but a memory, a reactivation, something already present, lying dormant, triggered by contact, cataclysm, or choice. We assume intelligence moves one way, forward. But what if it pulses? What if what we call evolution is simply the surfacing of what was once submerged? The ancient race may not have vanished because they failed. They may have chosen to step back, to let the world forget and begin again. A cycle not of destruction, but of renewal. Some say their blood runs in certain lineages, that ancient knowledge passed down in dreams, in instincts, in subtle traits, higher sensitivity, heightened perception, a pull towards the stars or the unseen. The idea of star seeds, humans with origins beyond Earth, is dismissed as spiritual fantasy. But what is myth, if not a way to preserve truths too strange for the language of science? What if those lineages exist not in royalty or power, but in silence? In the child who draws spirals without knowing why. In the elder who dreams of places they've never seen. In the deep urge some feel to protect the earth, though no one taught them how. Maybe these are not quirks. Maybe they are callings. Echoes of an ancestry too old to trace with blood, but present in vibration. Because if the ancient race understood anything, it was frequency. They knew that form follows vibration, that thought shapes matter, that consciousness is not confined to the brain, but is a field, one we share, influence, and inherit. The pineal gland, once dismissed as useless, has receptors for dimethyltryptamine. DMT, a molecule that induces intense, often mystical visions. It is produced naturally in many life forms and appears to activate during birth, death, and dreaming. Why? Why would nature evolve a molecule that opens gateways? Unless they were meant to be opened. Unless the ancients knew what modern science is only beginning to guess, that the body is not a prison, but a receiver, that the mind is not storage, but signal, and that the soul, if it exists, may be older than Earth itself. Perhaps the ancient race didn't give us tools. Perhaps they gave us the map, etched not in stone, but in bone, not in ruins, but in rhythm. And now, as we decode our own blueprint, as we stare at the double helix glowing on our screens, maybe we're beginning to see it. Not the instructions, but the intention, the pattern, the spiral, the invitation, to remember not only who we are, but who we were, and the quiet possibility that hums beneath every question. What if we were designed not to dominate, but to awaken? We are told to seek answers in the ground, in layers of sediment, in fossilized remains, in buried ruins. But some things aren't found below. They're seen above. Across cultures, across millennia, humanity has looked to the stars not as strangers, but as home. The night sky to the ancient ones was not a backdrop. It was a mirror, a guide, a living map of origins, endings, and return. And almost every culture tells of beings who came from the stars. In Egypt, the gods descended from the constellation Orion and the star Sirius, the same two celestial bodies to which the pyramids are aligned. In the lore of the Maya, the Pleiades were a place of origin, a cluster of fireflies in the sky from which the first knowledge came. The Maori traced their creation myths to those same 7 stars. The Zulu speak of the Nomo, aquatic beings from Sirius, who came to Earth long before humans walked it. In China, the Yellow Emperor was said to have descended from a dragon star, bringing with him wisdom, order, and the foundations of civilization. How can so many isolated cultures assign the same stellar homes to their ancestors? And why always the same constellations? Why Sirius, Orion, the Pleiades? We dismiss these as primitive mythologies, metaphors for crops and seasons, stories to explain the unknown. But ancient astronomy was anything but primitive. It was precise, consistent, and far-reaching. They tracked precession over thousands of years. They charted lunar cycles more accurately than modern calendars. They encoded celestial alignments in stone, in city grids, in myths repeated with ritual exactitude. And more than that, they remembered. They remembered the skies not as a mystery, but as memory. Graham Hancock once suggested that the stars may have once been a map for something else, a key, not to navigate the heavens, but to understand ourselves. As above, so below, the Hermetic maxim goes. But what if it's not philosophy? What if it's instruction? Many ancient sites around the world mirror the constellations. Teotihuacan's 3 pyramids reflect the belt of Orion. So do the Giza pyramids. The temples of Angkor Wat mirror the Draco constellation, not as it appears now, but as it appeared over 12,000 years ago. How could they have known? And more importantly, why? Why build monuments on Earth to match the heavens, unless those monuments were messages, markers, signals to something or someone watching? We often picture alien contact as loud, obvious, cinematic, but maybe it never was. Maybe the first contact didn't come in ships. Maybe it came as light, as sound, as code. Maybe the ancients didn't just witness visitors from the stars. Maybe they were taught by them, not in language, but in alignment, in the arrangement of sacred sites, in the rhythm of ritual calendars, in the structure of thought itself. Carl Sagan once mused that any sufficiently advanced civilization would not need to conquer or colonize. They would seed, inspire, trigger awakening through subtle architecture, the kind that outlasts empires. Could the ancient race have done just that? Could they have come not to rule, but to plant? Plant knowledge, geometry, memory, and then disappear, leaving only the questions behind. This may explain the strange consistency in origin myths, always beings from the sky, always a gift of knowledge, always a sudden leap in development. Why do the Dogon describe the orbit of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye and only confirmed by Western astronomers in the 20th century? Why do ancient Sumerian texts describe the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, with startling accuracy? Why are there stone carvings in Mesoamerica that resemble spacesuits, rocket ships, and beings manipulating strange machines? Are these just metaphors? Or are they memories, refracted through time, filtered through myth, misinterpreted by modern eyes? We often ridicule what we don't understand. We reduce ancient knowledge to stories, then mock the stories for not being science. But maybe they are something deeper than both. Maybe they are relics of a conversation we no longer know how to continue. And maybe the most unsettling idea is not that we were visited, but that we were never alone to begin with. That a part of us is not native to this planet. That our fascination with the stars is not curiosity, but longing. The philosopher Giordano Bruno was burned for suggesting that stars were suns, and that other worlds might have life. Today, that idea is taken for granted. But he said more. He said we are fragments, that the soul comes from elsewhere, that Earth is not a prison, but a school, and we are here to remember. Remember what? Perhaps that we carry in ourselves not just the code of survival, but the echo of something stellar. A frequency not of this earth, but bound to it through form. And maybe the ancient race, whether born of Earth or the stars, understood that the real journey is not outward but inward. Through myth, through memory, through the symbols they left behind. They are not meant to be decoded like puzzles. They are meant to awaken. And as we look to the stars again, through telescopes, through rockets, through longing, perhaps the moment is near when we no longer ask, "Are we alone?" But instead, who are we really? It's easy to think of history as a settled thing, a list of dates and names, a sequence of empires that rose and fell. But beneath that structure, something older hums, a story not told in textbooks or etched in monuments, but whispered, half-remembered, as if the Earth itself is keeping a secret. One of those secrets may lie in Antarctica. Today we know Antarctica as a frozen wasteland, desolate, lifeless, encased in ice over a mile thick. But it wasn't always that way. Beneath the surface lie fossilized forests, traces of tropical plants, even freshwater lakes sealed beneath the ice for millions of years. Recent satellite scans have revealed geometric anomalies under the ice, sharp angles, rectangular patterns, unnatural ridges that don't match the natural landscape. And then there's the Piri Reis map. Drawn in 1513, it shows the coast of Antarctica, not as it is today, but as it would be without ice. Smooth, detailed, aligned with modern geographic coordinates, centuries before such surveying was possible. How could a 16th century cartographer map what no one in his age had seen? He claimed he copied older source maps, lost documents from antiquity. But whose maps were they? We're told human civilization didn't begin until roughly 6,000 years ago. That writing came with Sumer, cities with Ur and Babylon. But to create a map like Piri Reis, you'd need advanced understanding of cartography, astronomy, geometry, and a global perspective. In short, you'd need civilization. And if such knowledge existed before the last ice age, then everything we believe about our origins begins to unravel. Who were the mapmakers? Were they survivors of a forgotten world? The idea of a pre-ice age civilization in Antarctica may sound like science fiction. But geological evidence suggests that the continent wasn't always frozen. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth underwent dramatic climate shifts, the same younger Dryas period many now associate with a potential impact event, one that triggered floods, extinctions, and upheaval. Could that event have buried more than ecosystems? Could it have sealed away entire cities? The ancient Greeks spoke of a place beyond the north wind, Hyperborea, a land of endless daylight, inhabited by long-lived beings of light and harmony. The Nazi regime, obsessed with esoterica, believed in a polar origin of humanity and sent expeditions to Antarctica searching for lost technology. Even today, military operations in the region are shrouded in secrecy. We cannot say what lies beneath the ice, but we can ask why so many cultures, separated by time and geography, share myths of a world to the south. A land once warm, now hidden. A cradle, not a corner. And perhaps that's the key. We keep assuming our ancestors were primitive, that they stumbled from caves to cities in a straight line. But the deeper we look, the more we find sophistication in places we least expect. The ancient builders of Pumapunku shaped diorite stones, second only to diamond in hardness, with angles so precise they suggest machining. Yet no tools have ever been found. The site was once dated to the 6th century, but radiocarbon testing on underlying soil layers pushes it back far further, possibly to the end of the last ice age. Again and again we see this same pattern. Ruins that appear out of place. knowledge that appears out of time, and always the silence that follows. Perhaps it's not absence that hides the truth, but erasure. Deliberate forgetting. The Maya had a word for this. Katun. A cycle of time in which knowledge is gained, lost, and regained. To them, history wasn't linear. It was circular, revolving like a wheel, each age a mirror of another, each fall a forgetting. And maybe the ancient race understood this better than we do. Maybe they knew that no civilization endures forever, that ice comes, that water rises, that memory fades. So they encoded what mattered, not in books, but in stone, not in language, but in form, alignments, ratios, resonance. They left seeds, not to be understood, but to pimaksense, but to be reawakened. And as we stare at the maps, the stars, the ice, the ruins, something stirs, a knowing we can't name, that we are not at the beginning, that we are standing on the edge of remembering. Not everything, but enough. Enough to ask, why are we so afraid to change the story? Is it because we're too attached to our place in it? If another civilization came before us, one that reached heights we cannot yet grasp, then we are not the peak. We are the echo. And maybe that's not a loss. Maybe it's a gift. Because if we've been here before, then perhaps we don't need to start over. Perhaps we're not lost, but circling back to a truth long known. Waiting beneath the ice. Waiting in our bones. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. And so, once more, the question drifts across the cold. What lies beneath the silence? There's a kind of amnesia that doesn't feel like forgetting. It feels like certainty, a calm assurance that what we've been told is all there is. But sometimes, certainty is the most effective way to hide something. The oceans cover over 70% of Earth's surface. We have explored only a fraction of them. In fact, we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the deep sea. And yet, in the stillness of those depths, the Earth keeps secrets, not because it's trying to deceive us, but because we haven't learned how to listen. Off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, lies a submerged structure that defies explanation. Massive stone terraces descend into the ocean floor, carved with straight edges, steps, and platforms. At first glance, it looks like a natural formation. But the angles are too clean, the cuts are too precise. There's symmetry, intention, purpose. Some believe it's a natural outcropping shaped by tectonic forces. Others insist it's the ruins of an ancient city, a civilization lost to the rising seas after the last ice age. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has studied the site for decades and argues that it bears every mark of human construction. Tool marks, roadways, what appear to be carvings of animals and humanoid faces. If that's true, then the site may be over 10,000 years old. Why is it that every time we find evidence suggesting an advanced civilization existed before our accepted timeline, it is dismissed as fantasy? The answer may not lie in science, but in narrative. Our current version of history depends on a clear beginning, a single point from which everything unfolds. If that point is moved, the whole structure begins to sway. And with it, the authority of those who guard the timeline. But the sea does not lie, it simply waits. There are ancient maps that show parts of the world no one in their time should have known. The Piri Reis map is the most famous, but there are others. The Orontius Phineus map, the Buache map. They depict Antarctica centuries before it was officially discovered, and not as a land of ice, but as rivers, mountains, coastlines. Some scholars claim these maps are fabrications, but others believe they were copied from older sources, remnants of a lost cartographic knowledge handed down through secret channels, only fragments of which survive today. Could those maps be echoes? Could they be the last remaining evidence of a global culture, one that existed before the flood myths, before the deluge that wiped clean the canvas of human history? If such a civilization once spread across the earth, it would have settled the coasts, the most fertile and hospitable regions. And when the glaciers melted, sea levels rose more than 400 feet, submerging everything. How many cities now lie beneath the waves? We have hints. In the Gulf of Cambay, off the coast of India, sonar scans revealed the outlines of a city older than the Harappan civilization. Roads, walls, basins, all covered in silt, preserved in darkness. Dated at nearly 9,000 years old, it challenges everything we know about the origin of urban life. Divers found pottery shards, human bones, tools, but the site is barely mentioned in textbooks. Research was halted. Controversy clouded what should have been wonder. Why the silence? It's not because the evidence is weak. It's because the implications are strong. If humans were building cities 9,000 years ago, what else were they doing? Were they observing the skies, tuning temples to star alignments, mapping the earth with precision lost to us now? And if so, where did they go? Perhaps the better question is, did they go anywhere at all? Maybe they became what we now call myth. Maybe they transformed their knowledge into oral stories, symbols, rituals, passed from generation to generation, slowly distorted by time, but never entirely lost. The Hopi speak of previous worlds, civilizations that rose, fell, and vanished beneath water or fire. We live now in the fourth world, they say, and each ending came not from ignorance, but from imbalance. The Maya tell of ages marked by suns, each destroyed when harmony was broken. In Hindu cosmology, we are in the Kali Yuga, the final age in a cycle of forgetting. But cycles, by their nature, return. What if this forgotten race didn't vanish? What if they receded? What if their legacy survives in sacred geometry, in myth, in the subtle architecture of the human mind? Some believe the knowledge was hidden, not in vaults, but in vibration, in frequencies that unlock memory, in symbols that trigger something dormant, temples that resonate, chants that alter brain waves, stories that strike something deep, something unspoken, as if the ancients encoded their memory not in language, but in resonance, waiting not for archaeologists, but for listeners, and we are beginning to hear them again, not with our ears, but with something older, a kind of remembering that doesn't require proof, only presence. You feel it when you walk among ruins, when you stand before a stone circle at sunrise, when you stare at the sea and feel like it's watching you back. You don't know why, but part of you remembers, and part of you wonders, what still sleeps beneath the waves? There are questions that grow louder the longer they are ignored, not because they demand attention, but because they remain unresolved, vibrating softly beneath the surface of accepted truth. Like a forgotten frequency, still pulsing beneath the noise. One such question lies in the stones, not the ones on the surface, but the ones buried deep, older than the pyramids, older than writing. In Turkey, not far from the better-known Göbekli Tepe, lies Karahan Tepe, another megalithic site, even less understood, yet potentially just as old, if not older. There, arranged in the earth, are towering T-shaped pillars, humanoid forms, strange symbols, and an eerie circular chamber sunk deep into bedrock, with a single pillar standing alone at its center. We do not know who built it. We do not know why. There are no bones, no burials, no tools, no fire pits, only architecture. Silence in stone. As if the builders did not live there, only remembered there. Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe both date to around 10,000 BCE, nearly 6,000 years before Sumer, before Egypt, before any known city. And yet, the carvings are complex, the geometry deliberate, the scale impossible. This is not the work of wandering hunter-gatherers. This is the work of knowledge, of intention, of memory. So who were they? We call them pre-pottery Neolithic people, as if the absence of ceramics explains the presence of brilliance. But no culture starts at its peak. No technology appears in perfect form without iterations. Göbekli Tepe is not an origin. It is a continuation. But a continuation of what? The site was not destroyed. It was buried, on purpose, covered carefully with layers of soil as if to preserve it or hide it. And this is where the mystery deepens. The burial seems ritualistic, not random, not abandoned, as if the builders knew their time had ended and sealed their legacy away for a future that might one day return. What kind of people do that? People who think in centuries, not decades. People who live within cycles, not timelines. People who remember. And they are not alone. In Bolivia, Tiwanaku, another megalithic site at high altitude, appears to have been built not in stages, but all at once. Enormous stone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, cut and shaped with uncanny precision, many of them strewn across the landscape, as if some tremendous force interrupted the work mid-construction. The site aligns with solstices and stars, and some researchers believe its original orientation suggests it was first aligned to celestial patterns over 17,000 years ago. That would place its origin not just before recorded history, but before accepted prehistory. Again, we're told, impossible. But the stones don't argue. They simply remain. Everywhere we look, there are whispers like these. In Armenia, the site of Karahunj, dubbed Armenia's Stonehenge, predates its British cousin by thousands of years. Carved holes in the stones align with stars. A stellar observatory? A temple? Or both? In Russia, the megaliths of Mount Shoria dwarf even Baalbek's massive stones. Cut granite blocks, some estimated to weigh over 3,000 tons, lie stacked in the mountains, as if forgotten by time. No written history, no clear explanation. Who had the tools, the will, the reason to build like this? And why always with stone? Because stone remembers. It doesn't decay. It doesn't rust. It doesn't lie. And maybe the ancients knew that their knowledge, their story, couldn't be passed through fragile means. So they encoded it in resonance, in proportion, in alignment, in structures meant not to impress, but to endure until someone looked again. But we have not been trained to see. We've been trained to doubt, not with healthy skepticism, but with obedience. To believe that if something doesn't fit within the accepted model, it must be error, hoax, or coincidence. Yet the model continues to fray. Too many ruins, too many alignments, too much precision from people who should not have known. And too much similarity. Spirals in Malta, T-shaped pillars in Turkey, serpents in Mesoamerica, star maps in stone, solar temples, sacred caves, myths of floods, of gods, of knowledge granted and lost, different tongues, same story. Could it be that this ancient race, whoever they were, left behind a unified language? Not of words, but of form, a global architecture of memory, a sacred science hidden in plain sight, not as domination, but as invitation. To awaken, to remember, to realize that we are not the first, and perhaps not the last. There is a concept in mythology, the eternal return. The idea that the world is not moving toward an end, but always returning to a beginning. That what was lost will be found. That what was buried will rise. And perhaps that's what's happening now. We're digging, not just in the earth, but in ourselves, in our assumptions, in our dreams, in the quiet ache that tells us this isn't the whole story. The ancient race is not gone. It left its breath in the stones, and its silence is beginning to speak again. Some stories don't end. They pause. They sink beneath the surface and sleep, waiting not for time to pass, but for someone, somewhere to remember how to listen again. We've followed the trail of stones, symbols, stars. We've walked among temples too old to name, monuments too precise to explain, myths too similar to dismiss. And each step brings us closer, not to an answer, but to a silence that feels intentional, as if someone, long ago, chose not to be found in full. And maybe that's the point. Because what if the ancient race we seek didn't leave behind a legacy for glory, but a riddle? One last offering, shaped not in gold or conquest, but in questions designed to awaken us. Perhaps the greatest of those riddles lies within ourselves. Modern science tells us we are recent, that Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, emerged around 300,000 years ago. That civilization began only 6,000 years ago. That writing, agriculture, astronomy, and law all flowered suddenly, as if from nowhere. But what happened in the space between? 250,000 years, silent, empty. We're told we wandered, hunted, gathered, waited for the spark. But what if the spark wasn't new? What if it was remembered? There are cultures today, still living, that hold oral traditions stretching back tens of thousands of years. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia tell stories of stars falling, oceans rising, land disappearing. Stories that align uncannily with known geological events, events that occurred 10,000 or even 20,000 years ago. And yet we call these myths, because they don't come in the form we expect, because they don't fit on a timeline ruled by stone tools and textbook kings. But maybe what we call prehistory is simply history we chose not to carry forward. Because it wasn't ours, or because it scared us. Imagine a world where time is not counted but lived in cycles, where memory isn't written down but carved into ceremony, where knowledge isn't stored but sung, where the most sacred truths are not explained but experienced. Such a world cannot be measured by carbon dating or satellite imagery. It exists in symbols, in instincts, in dreams. It exists where the line between science and spirit fades into something else, something harder to name. And maybe the people who lived in that world, the ones who built the first ziggurats and megaliths and temples, did not see themselves as inventors. They saw themselves as keepers, carriers of something older, something vast, something that was never meant to be owned, only passed on, But what happens when the chain breaks? When memory becomes myth? When the keepers are forgotten and the stones are reduced to puzzles? We happen. We, who inherited the fragments but not the framework, who worship the mechanisms but forget the meaning, who can launch satellites but can no longer hear the song beneath the stars. And yet something lingers. You can feel it in the geometry of ancient sites, the way they speak to the body even before the mind understands. You can feel it in the recurring shapes, spirals, triangles, serpents, circles. You can feel it in the myths that always begin the same way. There was a time before this time. The ancients were not obsessed with death. They were not building tombs. They were building time machines, memory chambers, resonant libraries, not to preserve the past, but to echo it forward. To now. Because they knew this forgetting would come. They knew a time would arrive when the story would fracture, when civilization would mistake technology for wisdom, when progress would drown out presence. They knew the signal would fade. But they also knew that someone, somewhere, would begin listening again. And maybe that's us. Maybe this moment, this hunger for truth behind the timelines, this ache for something more than history's straight line. Maybe it's not an accident. Maybe it's a return. Not to what was, but to what has always been. The ancients didn't leave instructions. They left invitations. They didn't say, look here. They said, feel this. Not with the intellect. With the whole self. Because some truths can't be told. They must be remembered. We began with a question. What if human civilization didn't begin in Sumer, but came from an ancient race? But the deeper we went, the more the question changed. Not who they were, but who we are. Because maybe we are not the aftermath of their collapse. Maybe we are their continuation, their rebirth, their next turning. And if that's true, if even a fraction of this is true, then history is not a path behind us. It's a spiral we're still walking. And at its center is not a date, or a name, or a place. At its center is a choice. To remember, or to forget again.